This is the Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. The Liberal Democrats are calling for the suspension of arms export licences to Israel. This comes after Baroness Varsi resigned as a Foreign Office Minister, arguing that Downing Street's stance on Israel's actions in Gaza was morally indefensible. It adds to the pressure on the Prime Minister David Cameron over Gaza, who has been accused by critics of not being critical enough. Israel launched Operation Protective Edge last month with the stated aim of ending rocket attacks and destroying tunnels that are used by Palestinian militants. Gaza officials say the conflict has killed 1,800 Palestinians. 67 Israelis have also died. Amid the claims and counterclaims, what do Jewish people on both sides of the debate think about the conflict in Gaza? Is it reported fairly? What about the Western response and Britain's policy on Israel? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Geoffrey Alderman. He's Professor of Politics and Contemporary History at the University of Buckingham. He's also author of the book British Jewry Since Emancipation. Also here is Glyn Secker from the Executive Committee of the group Jews for Justice for Palestinians. He also captained the boat to Gaza back in 2010. A warm welcome to you both. The move by Baroness Varsi and the kind of political fallout, Glyn, I mean, what do you make of it? Do you think that she is trying to capitalise, make political capital out of an issue that the British government says it is actually trying to work for change? It is perhaps doing things through the back door, through diplomacy channels, and that's the best approach, and progress is being made.
I think she's absolutely right to do what she did. She was lobbying inside the Conservative Party for quite some time. For them to take a more principled stand in opposition to what Israel has been doing to the Palestinians during Protective Edge. And she got nowhere with that lobbying and came to the point where, on principle, she resigned. And I think that's a commendable thing that she's done.
But do we know what Britain's policy on Gaza is? Has it been made clear?
That's a very good question, because it's not been made clear. What is clear is that the current government is really tailing behind the American position. Every now and again you have someone in the government making a statement about calling on Israel to be proportional in its response, not really saying anything about our own engagement with the Israelis, anything about the discussions that might have taken place between British government and Israeli representatives, certainly not making any comment on the £24 million per annum arms trade that British companies have with Israel.
I'll turn to you, Geoffrey. I mean, this call by Nick Clegg for the suspension of arms export licences to Israel, is that the right move?
Well, it might be the right move for him to try and get as many British Muslims to vote for the Lib Dems as possible at the next election. I mean, clearly that's the name of the game. I was personally very disturbed by Baroness Varsi's letter of resignation. I think it's a very sinister letter, because if you read it carefully, what she's saying to the government is, if you don't do what I want you to do regarding Gaza, you may have a problem in this country with radicalised British Muslims. That is a threat. I regard it as political blackmail. And I think that David Cameron, for whom I have no particular love politically or anywhere else, was quite right to send her away with the flieger here and say, well, if you want to go, we'll get on without you.
Yeah, I take a very different perspective on that. Firstly, from a Jewish perspective, as a representative of a Jewish organisation, the first thing we do is to say that what Israel is doing is not in our name. Israel does not represent us. It does not represent hundreds of thousands of Jews here, mostly in America, because that's where the largest Jewish population is outside Israel. We won't allow Israel to speak for us, because we come from a different position, one which is based on human rights and morality. If Israel succeeds in identifying all Jews with the horrendous actions that they're taking at the moment, have been taking during Protective Edge, it's not surprising that there will be a reaction in the world against all Jews. So we think we actually have a particular responsibility to say loud and clearly, not in our name. This is not being done in the name of all Jews. It's being done in the name of Israel and this current government and the settlers and their programme. And we dissociate ourselves from that. If people don't stand up for moral rights, and there's no diplomatic or democratic avenue for those rights being addressed, then people will get angry, and you will have youth who are radicalised, and it will feed into anti-Semitism.
But you do condemn that, Glyn, don't you?
I condemn any anti-Semitism, absolutely, of course. But you have to look at the causes of it. And if the cause, in this case, of the growth of anti-Semitic feeling across wide swathes of the world, if the cause of that is human violations of human rights on a gigantic scale, then you have to address the cause.
Just, Geoffrey, I mean, do you think that it's fair that people are conflating the actions of the Israeli government, and certainly in particular with Gaza, with the aspirations of Jews worldwide? There's protests throughout Europe, for instance, over the last couple of weeks, and quite violent and nasty protests.
There's no question that there's a rise in anti-Semitism. And one of the achievements of Hamas is to have demonstrated that when push comes to shove, there's really no difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Actually, I personally regret that. As a historian, I look back to a time when we have to agree that anti-Zionism was quite fashionable within British Jewish communities. But that was before the recreation of a Jewish state. And that recreation, whether you think that Israel should speak for all Jews or shouldn't speak for all Jews, personally, I've never met anyone who would claim that they speak for all Jews. It's a silly claim. But whether you think that or not, the equation has changed.
But, and that's the point, isn't it, Glyn, that many people would dispute that Netanyahu would ever claim to be acting on behalf of all Jews worldwide. Do you feel that he does, just by sheer implication?
Well, I think the general sentiment in Israel is that they do. There was an article in the Times of Israel just day before yesterday, commenting on the National Union of Students in the UK recently voting to support the boycott movement against Israel. And the gist of that argument in the Times was that because the journalist writing it identified as a Jew wholly and absolutely with Israel, then any boycott against Israel was a boycott against himself as a person. And he then leapt from that to the position that the National Union of Students was boycotting Jewish students, which it definitely was not. And therefore he was saying perhaps we should, as Jews, all now wear the yellow star, with a reference back to fascist Germany. Now, that is the general drift of the arguments coming out of Israel. I'll give you an example of the sort of homogeneity of the Jewish establishment, if you like, here. We put an advertisement in The Guardian yesterday saying that we completely dissociate ourselves from protective edge, that it's abhorrent to us. The first line of that advertisement said, "You're reading this in The Guardian because the Jewish Chronicle refused to take the advertisement," which is true. Earlier on, so they don't want the debate. Earlier on, we wrote to the Board of Deputies, the Jewish Board of Deputies, asking them to make a moral statement about the arrest and maltreatment of Palestinian children as young as 12 being arrested in the middle of the night and taken off to Israeli prisons, i.e. not in the occupied territories, but in Israel itself, sometimes held in solitary confinement for days at a time, maltreated to the point of being almost to torture, reported by a UK Foreign Office funded investigation and report. We asked them to comment on it, and there was silence.
Do you recognise that, Geoffrey, that there is clearly there will be a degree of division among Jewish communities in the UK about what's going on in Gaza, but do you feel that, would you agree with that statement that a newspaper like the Jewish Chronicle wouldn't want to accept perhaps Jews from the other end of the spectrum?
Well, I can't speak for the Jewish Chronicle. I just write a weekly column for them. I'm not the editor. You'd have to ask the editor. Clearly, there is no one Anglo-Jewish voice on anything. We talk about the Anglo-Jewish community. There's no such thing. There are a separate set of communities, some of whom unfortunately are simply not on speaking terms with each other, really for religious reasons rather than political reasons. So you have within Anglo-Jewry, and let's get this in perspective, British Jews are no more than absolutely maximum 350,000. We're an absolutely drop in the ocean of the United Kingdom population, but you have an enormous variety of opinions there. I personally am certainly in favour of all sides of all debates being heard. You've kindly referred to my latest book. In there I give the space that I deem proper to various independent Jewish voices, Jews for Justice for Palestinians, even Jews for Jesus. They're all Jews. And you know the saying, Brendan, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And there are very lively debates going on within the British Jewish communities as to the actions of Israel, the inactions of Israel, the hypocrisy of certain opponents of the State of Israel, faith schools and so, you name it, there's a debate going on about it.
But do you feel that you're on your own? I mean, do you feel that your group is against the tide of Jewish opinion if you feel that you have to go to the Guardian newspaper to perhaps get that kind of publicity that you want?
Definitely a minority opinion. I mean, we also, when we wrote to the Board of Deputies, we wrote to the Jewish Leadership Council, which is the voice of liberal Judaism. And we didn't get a response from them either. We're the only ones. I mean, there's some other even smaller groups than us. You know, you say the Jewish community in the UK is a drop in the ocean. We're a drop in the ocean of the Jewish community. We have 1,800 members. So we're small, but we feel we're significant. There's some even smaller groups which have been around for a long time who also are opposed to Israel's current policies. But apart from them, we're the only group that gets up on the platform and makes our voices clear, because you're right, there's a debate within the Jewish community, but the tradition within the Jewish community is it's always kept behind closed doors. And I'm pointing to a real danger for that, because it means that if the world outside of the Jewish community doesn't see that there's Jewish dissent from what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, then the outside community will think all Jews think the same. All Jews are behind these atrocious violations in Gaza at the moment, and that will stoke anti-Semitism, and that's dangerous.
Is there that danger?
Clearly there is that danger if people conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Of course there's that danger. There was a time when anti-Zionism was fashionable within British Jews. That was before the recreation of the Jewish state. But that does not mean that all Jews necessarily support all actions of all Israeli governments. After all, British Jews do not elect Israeli governments. I don't have a vote in as a member of the Israeli electorate. If Glyn is right that his organisation represents, what was it, Glyn, 1,000 and something?
800.
1,800 or so Jews. I mean, what kind of a voice does he think, proportionally, I'll use this phrase, he should have? Should an organisation of 1,800 have the right to have an advertisement in the Jewish Chronicle? I raise that question. I'm not the editor of the Jewish Chronicle. He's having a voice now. He didn't get a voice in the Jewish Chronicle, but he will have a voice in the Guardian. I may even write about him. So he'll have a voice in the Jewish Chronicle then. But if he's saying that my 1,800 or 799 Jewish brethren deserve their policies to be adopted by British Jewry, then we are on a slippery slope. And if he's further saying, if the policy of me and my 1,799 brethren, if the policy is not adopted, we might have more anti-Semitism in this country, then I think Glyn needs to reflect on where that slippery slope leads to.
When I talked about Jewish Leadership Council as liberal, I meant with a small L. What I think is dangerous is the way in which Israel attempts to close down criticism. It has an argument that goes like this. Israel represents all Jews. It's the Jewish state. Therefore, to criticize Israel is to criticize Jews and therefore to be anti-Semitic. And if anti-Semitism spreads to large proportions, then we know, they say, where that leads. It leads into the direction of the Holocaust. And that therefore it closes down criticism. Now, if you can't criticize Israel, it puts Israel in an ivory white tower. It then puts it beyond criticism. It can then take whatever actions it likes. And then it's beyond moral reproach. Now, that is seriously dangerous, and that's what I think is happening in Israel at the moment.
I simply don't recognise this. As someone who visits Israel, I'm privileged to hold a visiting chair at Ariel University in Israel. That there is a lot of debate in Israel about peace, war, the economy, marriage, divorce. Should Israel be a secular state? Should it be a theocracy? Very lively debates are going on. But I have noticed, just as in this country, before 1939, there were very lively debates about appeasement, which was very popular. When the chips were down in 1939, the country came together. And that is what has happened in Israel at the moment. But I don't think it's right to say that Israel shuts off debate. I have criticised Israel. I have a weekly column in the Jewish Chronicle, as I said. I've criticised Israel. Nothing wrong with that. It's a country where you have democratic values, freedom of expression.
Israel, as Geoffrey says, is a democracy. It's a thriving democracy. It's a technological hub. It's a thriving economy, and this discussion is able to be had in a country which is not able to be had anywhere else in the Middle East.
Well, it is and it isn't a democracy. The opposition to Protective Edge at the moment, a small demonstration took place fairly recently. Unlike the big Peace Now demonstrations that occurred during Cast Lead, the previous major attack, well, the one before the last one on Gaza, where large numbers turned out on the streets, here it was fairly small. It was fairly small because the police turned away half a dozen of their coaches. The police didn't protect the demonstrators. They were attacked with stones by extremists. And they had a really tough time. But it's not a democracy in a much more important way than that. Israel has occupied the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza. We can discuss what's meant by the occupation of Gaza now. For a long time, since 1967. The controlling authority, the military controlling authority of the occupied Palestinian territories is the military. The Palestinians are subjected to military law. The settlers, who are all illegal under international law, their settlements are illegal, are subjected to or live under Israeli civilian law. The Palestinians have no vote in the Israeli democratic process. So I would contest that it's actually a democracy.
I suppose, Geoffrey, in terms of how this latest conflagration sparked up 4 weeks ago, the Israeli line was that this was because of 3 teenagers that were kidnapped and tragically killed in the most awful circumstances. This was blamed on Hamas, although Hamas did deny responsibility. There's a tit-for-tat going on. There's claims and counterclaims, but I guess what Glyn is outlining there is that it goes far more. It goes back, of course, a lot further than that. You could even cite the Balfour Declaration as being the root of all this. Does this help the narrative?
I do get depressed as a historian by discussions like this descending into history. It may sound a peculiar thing for a historian to say. The fact of the matter is the Arab world has never accepted the right of Jewish self-determination.
Not even Jordan and Egypt, which have...
They've accepted it in a very pragmatic sense as the best that they can do for the time being.
But deep down they don't accept it.
Deep down they don't. There is at the moment, in all but name, a military alliance between the government of Egypt and the government of Israel over how to deal with Hamas. Now, the thing you can say about Hamas is, at least it's truthful. You read its charter says that the Jewish state must be destroyed and Jews must be killed. My own take on this is that the origins of this dispute are religious. You are never going to get the Muslim world to accept the right of Jews to have a Jewish state in what is called in Arabic the Dar el-Islam, the realm or the house of Islam. They regard the state of Israel, even within the 1967 ceasefire lines, which are only armistice lines, they are never going to accept that as legitimate. We're not talking here about conflict resolution. We're talking, let's be realistic, about conflict management. I don't see any short or even medium-term solution to this.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the crisis in Gaza. Two Jewish viewpoints with Glyn Secker, member of the group Jews for Justice for Palestinians. He also captained the boat to Gaza in 2010. Also here in the studio is Geoffrey Alderman, Professor of Politics and Contemporary History at the University of Buckingham. He's also author of the book British Jewry, Since Emancipation. Are we forgetting how, many would say, how vile Hamas can be? I mean, as Geoffrey has pointed out, their stated aim is to exterminate the state of Israel.
And Jews.
And Jews. I'm just wondering, it's built no shelters. Civilians are using UN schools. It's ordered Gazans to ignore Israeli warnings to flee their houses, stay put under bombardment. They're accused of having human shields. They're accused of firing missiles close to hospitals, if not in hospitals. Shifa Hospital is alleged to be a command centre. I mean, are we forgetting, is Hamas and their actions, do you think that they're reported fairly?
I think the way in which we have to think of Hamas is very much the way in which I, as a British subject, and many people in Britain came to think about the IRA. Absolutely horrific actions by the IRA, kneecappings, bombings in Birmingham, civilian areas, no policy towards civilians that I could possibly entertain supporting. But there was a brilliant headline in a newspaper after the Birmingham bombings in this country. And the headline was, "Stop the bombings, get the troops out." And therefore, it identified the root cause. When you have a population, 1.8 million people, blockaded into a tiny area of that is Gaza, just a few square miles, they've been subjected to a blockade for 7 years, where one of the generals who was instigating that blockade said, "We are putting the Palestinians on a diet." And a few years later, another general said, and you need to think about this, he said, "No one in Gaza dies of old age anymore." It takes a moment for that to sink in. And what he meant was, actually they're dying of other causes, of malnutrition, of bad water, of inadequate medical supplies and services. So you have a system which is killing people before their time with the blockade. Now, I just turn the example round. If it had actually been the case, just hypothetically, that Israel had been blockaded by all the surrounding Arab countries, and hypothetically if they had at their disposal state-of-the-art weaponry, as Israel does, and they had maintained that blockade air, sea and land, if every few years they had flown over Israel and destroyed the water system, the sewage system, the electricity systems, the whole infrastructures. And if Israel had been unable to find a solution through diplomatic and democratic avenues to that blockade, no one in their right mind anywhere in the world would criticize Israel for trying to break out of that blockade using force. What happened in the end in Ireland was that there were negotiations with the IRA. Because you don't negotiate with your friends, you negotiate with your enemies. And you got a just solution in Ireland. There are still barriers, there are 90-something barriers still in Northern Ireland. The animosity is still very much there, but it's peace and people get on with their lives, and that's what should happen. Can I just ask you, you go to Ariel University. Ariel University is in a settlement, an illegal settlement.
Rubbish. That's rubbish. Ethnic Jews under international law have the right, under international law, Brendan, have the right to establish communities in Judea and Samaria, under international law. No international legal tribunal has ever ruled against this.
OK, but on the point of using the IRA parallel, Geoffrey, at least with the IRA, there were negotiations. And many people do see Benjamin Netanyahu as being determined to block Palestinian aspirations for nationhood. Would you accept that?
If Glyn is saying jaw is better than war, he'll have me as his strongest supporter. And I'm going to renew now an undertaking that I've made in public before, that I will use my good offices to ensure safe passage for a delegation from Hamas in Gaza to Jerusalem to sit down with the Israeli government and hammer out a peace treaty. Brendan, what do you think the chances are of my offer being taken up by Hamas?
Well, what do you think the chances are would be, Glyn?
Well, my understanding is that they're actually in negotiations at the moment. The first round of negotiations, which Egypt brokered, did not include Hamas, and that's why Hamas rejected them, because they didn't have an input into them. There is an input now. I don't know if they're actually managing to sit down at the same table as the Israeli representatives. Initially, the Israeli representatives would never talk to Hamas. I'm quite sure that Hamas will talk in those negotiations. I have to say that when we sailed our Jewish boat to try to break the siege of Gaza in 2010, while we were at sea, we got, through our communications centre in London, a telephone call from Hamas saying, "We welcome your boat." It was a peace boat. We had no arms on board. We had aid, medical aid, and water purification machines and outboard motors.
What was your particular aim? I mean, obviously to provide supplies, but more symbolic than that.
It was a tiny boat, and you're right, it was absolutely symbolic. But we wanted to make a statement. There were Jews who opposed the blockade of Gaza and took in some symbolic aid, and to say there are Jews who have a different perspective. And Hamas wanted a reply from us. We had a bit of heated discussion, a lively discussion really, about what our reply should be. And in the end we said, we come in peace. If you if your welcome is welcoming us in peace, we welcome your welcome. Particularly convoluted Jewish sort of statement, and they welcomed us.
And in terms of the negotiations, though, 2 years after that, in 2012, Egypt brokered another ceasefire, but it was a very different Egypt, led by Mohamed Morsi, who's now in jail. Yep. At the moment, we have an Egyptian leader who would like to see the destruction of Hamas. How reliant would Israel be on Egypt to ensuring some kind of path to peace?
Israel has to deal with the government that it finds in Egypt. Morsi was up to a point, quite supportive of Hamas. The present Egyptian government isn't, and it's not only the Israelis that have been destroying tunnels, it's the Egyptian government as well. Again, this is pragmatic. I have to say this, however, to go back to your point about a two-state solution. Another thing worth bearing in mind is that Hamas has achieved the end of the two-state solution. Brendan, I'm convinced that is now off the table.
Because of Hamas, not because of Netanyahu.
Yes. Hamas succeeded a couple of weeks ago in closing down Ben Gurion Airport for 48 hours. Do you think any Israeli government is going to permit an independent Palestinian state based on Ramallah on the West Bank, of which Hamas is a member, bearing in mind that if rockets from Gaza can shut down Ben Gurion Airport for 48 hours, what could they do from rockets in Ramallah and Jenin? The two-state solution is now dead.
Creating a Palestine along the lines of something resembling pre-1967 would give Palestinians superb targets. Tel Aviv, Haifa. Israel won't countenance that, will they?
Israel's got three choices in terms of a solution. Two-state solution or two forms of a one-state solution. One-state solution, option A, would be to open Israel up to a democracy where Palestinians have the vote, where all religions are allowed to practice freely and safely, and where everyone can get on with their lives peacefully. And I might say there's a tremendous thirst for that amongst the whole of the Palestinian people. The second one-state solution would be where the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, probably Gaza as well, come under the alternative vision that Bennett and Lieberman have, which is to take military control of the whole of the West Bank, areas A, B and C, to remove the Palestinians from the majority of the land holdings, to force them into townships, to keep control of them more easily when they're holed up in that fashion. And I can tell you that that scenario would be a replication of apartheid South Africa. So you have the three scenarios.
No,
and what are you going to do? You have a moral obligation to a people you have occupied under international law to care for the human rights of those people.
There is another solution. It's the one that I personally favour. At the moment, the West Bank is divided into three areas, A, B and C. And the majority of Jews live in Area C. My own solution, which I've gone public about, is for Israel to annex Area C, which has, I think, approximately 50,000 Arabs in it, and give those Arabs Israeli citizenship and full voting rights, as they have in East Jerusalem, incidentally, at the moment. And areas A and B would become internally self-governing, but with Israel, certainly for the foreseeable future, controlling the borders of that internally self-governing entity. As for Gaza, the best solution at the moment is to place it once more under United Nations authority as a sort of mandate.
And I guess, I mean, when we're talking about the role of Egypt, it does really feel that Britain is sidelined in this particular discussion, which kind of makes...
Well, it is, yes.
Precisely. So it's not really something that Washington or London can contribute to. It has to happen within the region.
Well, hang on. I mean, America funds Israel's existence to the tune of $3.5 billion a year.
And that's not going to change, though, is it?
No, but it means that America is a major player in the region, and that's just for starters.
But not being listened to.
Because
the State Department criticised Israel last week,
quite
vociferously, and it made no difference.
I have to say that I am desperately disappointed with Obama. When he came in, he told Netanyahu, rather naively actually, to stop the settlements expansion. Netanyahu made a rude gesture and announced expansion of settlements. And the reason for that is that actually something we haven't talked about so far is there is a huge support for Israel coming not from, obviously from the Jewish lobby in the States, which is coordinated by AIPAC, but also from the Christian Zionists. Now, Christian Zionists are number 40 million. They can count on the votes of somewhere approaching 70 million. They have huge financial resources, and therefore they're very influential in Congress. And that's why the bulk of the people in Congress, when Netanyahu visited, gave him 22, 27 standing ovations, because they are extremely powerfully lined up behind Israel for what I think are rather peculiar religious reasons, which I won't go into. That has hobbled Obama's policies, and Obama hasn't had the courage, given that he's in the second stage of his presidency, not worrying about being re-elected. He could actually be much more outspoken and much more influential than he is. But America's interests in the Middle East are about finance and economy. That's what the Oslo Accords are about. It shackled the Palestinian economy. Your solution of Israel taking over Area C would mean that those settlements, which are pitched on all the water resources, would follow the Oslo Accords, which gave control of the water to Mekarot, the Israeli water company. They control the water and they sell it back at 5 times its price to the Palestinians.
I suppose some would say that actually, I mean, what Benjamin Netanyahu's next move would really be driven by, I guess, domestic concerns. And in fact, a poll said this week that 82% of Israelis are satisfied with his performance during the Gaza crisis. That's actually twice Barack Obama's approval rating in the US. Yeah. It seems to suggest that international pressure won't really make any impact on what he does next.
No, actually, I agree in general with Glyn's assessment of Obama. I was frankly quite fearful about the second term, because the danger for Israel has always been an American president in the second term, not the first. But Obama has come out of this as a weakling who vacillates between one policy and another, and who has appointed as a Secretary of State John Kerry, about which the defamation laws in this country would prevent me from saying what I really feel about him. I think Kerry has been a walking disaster area for the Obama administration. Obama has very little influence in this. The polls, as you say, Brendan, are showing tremendous support for Netanyahu, and I hope he will use this to try and engage in positive conflict management, as I mentioned earlier on.
I'll just give you the final word, Glyn. So what do you do now? What does your group do now? What kind of impact are you trying to make?
I think we're at a watershed. I think Protective Edge is now Israel's Sharpeville. The moment when the South African government shot down a peaceful demonstration in Sharpeville and the world's eyes opened. And I think this is going to give a big impetus to the boycott, disinvestment and sanctions movement, which is essentially and wonderfully a peaceful, non-violent movement. And I think we're on that long road that led to the changes in South Africa. I hope they're going to lead to the changes in Israel-Palestine. I'd like to end by just quoting Rabbi Hillel: "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbour."
Well, look, many thanks for joining us. We've run out of time. That's Glyn Secker from the Executive Committee of the group Jews for Justice for Palestinians. Also here in the studio, Geoffrey Alderman. He's a professor of politics and contemporary history at the University of Buckingham and author of the book British Jewry Since Emancipation. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.